Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome back Jessie Mahoney, pediatrician and certified coach. Today's Kevin MD article is The Burden of the Eldest Daughter. Jessie, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me back.
All right. What's this latest article about?
Well, this article is about the burden of the eldest daughter, but my podcast co-host and I did a podcast about the eldest daughter, and I had no idea that it was going to resonate so much. And then shortly thereafterwards, Taylor Swift started talking about the eldest daughter, and I was like, what is going on? And what I realized is since then is I have been asking women physicians in my groups and at retreats, and I would say that like 85 to 90% of women physicians are eldest daughters, which is just shocking, cool, interesting, and on the other hand, expected, because this sort of eldest daughter role, I am an eldest daughter, and my podcast co-host is an eldest daughter. We didn't even recognize this, that we are sort of expected / raised to be the over responsible, over functioning, over performing from a super young age. And so because of that, many of us end up in medicine because it's sort of a natural extension. We get praised for all the caregiving of either younger siblings or older grandparents or whatever it is. And so we sort of noticed this funnel, which looks different in medicine than it does just in the general population, I think, because medicine is really set up to take advantage of that, or we reward it and it's taken advantage of. And so we just had this really interesting exploration of it. And I had so many people reach out that I decided that I should share this idea more broadly, because it's really the freedom and understanding that it has a lot to do with how you were raised, how you got here. So many of us sort of blame ourselves about overfunctioning and overwhelm and how come I don't have boundaries. And it turns out that that was a huge part of how we ended up in medicine and how we were raised. A super interesting thing about this, which came up in our own podcast and has come up many times since, is the recognition, though, that we don't really know where it came from. So sometimes we think, oh, it's just because you're the oldest daughter. But like, were we then responsible and that was rewarded, so we became more responsible, or were we expected to do that? Because it starts so young that there is just no clarity about it. And when people start to explore it in depth, we don't know really what happened in our childhood. And so part of us just wants to blame our parents or blame society or blame someone. And yet I think it's also an incredibly complex phenomenon. And yet just simply being aware of it and noticing it can really shift your whole experience of being it. And you get then the agency to choose how you want to move forward.
And when you talked about this on your own podcast that you and your co-host mentioned it, tell us like the range of responses you get. You said it really resonated with your listeners.
What the biggest thing is that most people were eldest daughters and hadn't recognized that this role and these issues that they're trying to change now started when they were 5 or younger. And so it was this real liberation and like, oh, well, this explains a lot. And so it gave them just to let go of the blame. You know, I often talk about how medicine acculturates us, but for this group of women, which is huge, as it turns out. I mean, literally now I ask in every group, and there's maybe 1 or 2 people who are not an eldest daughter. And an eldest daughter, I'm an eldest daughter, but I have an older brother. But that doesn't matter because you're still the eldest daughter. Or if you're an only daughter or an only child who happens to be a daughter, it also applies. And so it's this idea of understanding and recognition of where these patterns began, and that then they led to one thing, which led to the next thing, which led to the next thing. That's the piece that really resonates. And then the idea that this was sort of our role in our family, but it does not have to be. So there are many women physicians who are now in their 50s who are carrying that older daughter responsibility to caring for aging parents and caring for their entire department as a department chief. It bleeds into leadership roles tremendously. And so the phenomenon, I think, is that people feel this tremendous freedom. They feel seen, and then they get to choose. It doesn't actually mean that they won't take care of their elders, and it doesn't actually mean that they're not going to be an amazing chief, but
Mhm.
they're going to decide sort of who are they now and what is the energy that they want to make these choices from. Because eldest daughters aren't making a choice.
Mhm.
They're just sort of taking what's handed in most cases. And so it's recognizing that this over functioning began long, long ago and was sort of a setup for where they are now.
Now, you alluded to some of these characteristics
Mhm.
earlier, like overfunctioning, but let's
Yeah.
drill down a little bit. What are some specific traits that connect these eldest daughters together?
the the more you do, the more you get rewarded. And
Mm.
so in our families, we're often the one, I have a younger brother who's 12 and a half years younger, and I just stepped into raising him. That's sort of what we are expected to do. And so there's a lot of this, what I would call hyper responsibility, caregiving at a very young age. And some of it is helpful and not, because I would say also over worrying. We
Mhm.
tend to be the ones with whom a mother will share her worries or share concerns. And so we actually will start to take on some of that responsibility. I grew up in a family where things were not super monetarily steady, and my mom was always worried about it. And so then my response to that was, I need a steady job. I need a career where, people don't get fired. I need a career where you make enough money. And it's subtle. You're not really noticing that, but you're eliminating things along the way. These are also people who don't ask for help. They clean up on their own. They make dinner for the
Yeah.
family. They're always sort of planning ahead, and being hyper vigilant is one thing I see often. And so you might see people out in the world when their families are traveling. They're the ones who are making sure that things are getting taken care of. I have a niece who's an eldest daughter, and she is always making sure her little brother is,
Mhm.
organized, and everyone in the family knows where they're going and when. And that has become her role. And she's not even 8, And so you can see it play out. I don't know that she'll go into medicine, but she might. And and just to notice that it's not that they're bad things, because they're actually really
Yeah,
helpful
yeah.
and our society rewards them. But what ends up happening is that becomes the expectation, and we get so much reward that we can't see another pattern. And then when we show up in medicine, it's like, oh, well, they can do all these things. This is
Yeah.
great. Let's just keep rewarding it. And it becomes the expectation there. And in fact, I think that the system is kind of relying on it.
Yeah.
It is similar to the way everyone in medicine is trained. But when it's the root of, something you've experienced since you were 3 or 5, I mean, it really starts young. It it it's much harder to separate what's you and what's the system.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really resonated with people. And what I see people light up about is when they see that how many other people are eldest daughters, they're like, oh my gosh, like that explains a lot. And they feel very seen, because I also think eldest daughters tend to not feel appreciated and
Yeah.
seen. We very well might be, but for whatever reason, it's a real challenge to allow ourselves to be seen and appreciated and valued. And so that is another piece of it. And when you're in a collective of others who feel that way, that's where you can start to peel things off and begin to change it from sort of, I'm just going to have boundaries about everything and say no about everything. You can have a little bit more agency and authenticity around
Mhm.
what is you and what isn't you, because we've sort of lost that perspective.
Now, you mentioned earlier that these eldest daughters choose medicine because of some of their traits, but it's a
Mhm.
little bit symbiotic. Medicine chooses these traits as well, right?
Absolutely. And so I think that's really the challenge, because it becomes so intertwined that we don't really know, well, what is medicine? What is us? What is reasonable? What is not reasonable? I talk a lot about our expectations, and for women physicians in particular, but I also think in medicine, like what is reasonable and
Yeah.
unreasonable is very confusing. And so what we expect of ourselves is generally unreasonable, but we think it's totally reasonable.
Hmm.
And then what we expect if we're a leader of all the people we work with is also generally unreasonable. And then we allow expectations of us to be unreasonable because we're so comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And then it's like, why can't I do all of these things well? And so it becomes hard to see it, to see what is, I will say, what's reasonable for you to do as a physician. And part of me wonders, and I almost don't wonder, I know that this way of being is, adding into burnout and adding into just the exodus of women physicians in medicine. And if women physicians are now over half of the physicians being trained, recognizing this pattern and helping people see, well, okay, I am an eldest daughter. What is mine? Maybe I can pass this off to my younger sister or my younger brother, or I have been working on gifting things back. I have two brothers, gifting some of the things back to them. Like, I'm complete. Maybe you can take this on for a while. And it's interesting because what I have also discovered is if you ask, people are willing to help. And so a lot of it is on us because we've never asked.
Yeah. So you mentioned the process of setting boundaries and letting go, but like you said earlier, all their lives, they haven't done any of that. They haven't set those boundaries. They haven't delegated. But in order to reduce the incidence of burnout, that's something that they probably have to learn to get started or learn to disassociate themselves from that particular identity. You mentioned the words peeling back. So what are some steps to go about doing that?
Yeah, I think the first step is awareness. And so seeing that it's not your fault. So it's awareness and non-judgment, which are tenets of mindfulness. So slowing down enough to notice where you aren't boundaried or watching potentially other people where they're boundaried and where it works. We often look at them and sort of are frustrated with them, but instead, what can we learn? Where are boundaries possible? And if which most people want to stay in medicine and want to be able to keep practicing, then we really do, I say, want to figure out a way to make it sustainable. And so when you can step out of the judgment of, more is better and taking care of everyone is not your responsibility, it's looking around for people who can help and what can you do that will allow you to stay practicing medicine healthily? I think sometimes we, especially in primary care, we want to address everything. I have a lot of physicians who come to work with me and they say, no, my job is to answer all the questions and make sure that everything they want to taken care of today is taken care of. And that's not realistic in a 15-minute visit. So part of it is actually owning sort of your knowledge and your expertise and saying, we're going to cover these 3 things today, or this is my agenda for someone who's here with cancer or here with a 6-month-old. What are your questions? And we'll make sure, to touch on them at the end, but you can also then decide that those aren't necessarily there for you. I've seen some clients decide that they're going to focus on 1 or 2 things a visit, even though, I'm a pediatrician. So the AAP standard is cover all 29,000 things, which is not realistic. And what they've discovered is their patients are actually healthier and they're enjoying their career and they're planning to stay. And so it's a trust in yourself that we actually have a lot of training to know what's important. And so can we lean into that rather than, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to do that from an angry place. I often talk about boundaries coming from a place of love, and that sounds very woo and fluff. But what that means is love for you so that if you want to stay in medicine, you can. Love for your patients, because our patients all need a doctor, and it's so hard to find a doctor right now. And love for the system of medicine would actually be clear about what you can do and what you cannot do. And I think assessing this idea of what's reasonable and unreasonable is extremely powerful to recognize well, what is actually doable in a 15-minute visit? What is actually doable in a day at work? What is actually doable in 24 hours as potentially a mom, daughter, sister, whatever else? And if you struggle with the word reasonable or unreasonable, you could change it to human. What's a human expectation? When we've been made heroes, we're expected to sort of do things that are not human. And I think that the eldest daughter thing ties into the hero. We're the savior of the families. That's how we see ourselves. It's not even conscious at all. It's just that if we don't do it, someone else won't do it, for example. And so then what happens? And we go into our default, terrible things happen, and it'll be our fault. And so I think this idea of recognizing reminds me of the excellence. Excellence is actually other people doing their job. Excellence is letting your medical assistant do things. Excellence is letting colleagues do things, and recognizing that we don't have to and can't do it all ourselves.
So tell us a success story, perhaps from your coaching experiences. Have you been able to successfully help someone with this eldest daughter syndrome and who is burnt out because that's who their identity is tied to. What kind of things do you do in your coaching sessions? And tell us a success story of what that would look like.
And so really what it looks like is recognizing that you are an eldest daughter and what that means and where these traits came from. And then it's choosing how you want to move forward differently. And I actually see a lot of people who so they might change roles. So sometimes people will be, for example, a full spectrum OBGYN, and then they will change to being a laborist, or they'll change to doing clinic only. Not because they have to, but because they want to, because they want to have more limits. They will start asking for help, or, some people in their specific practice will change how they interact with patients. And so I mentioned this pediatrician who has changed her clinic visits, and she is someone who is going to retire early and is now staying because she likes her job. And so it's recognizing that seeing this role and seeing how it impacts you gives you the ability to choose how much of it you want to carry forward. And we had a podcast a bit ago about caring for aging parents. And I will say that's actually where I see it being the most impactful, is stepping back from that role, not because you don't care, but letting other siblings who may or may not be physicians, right? Because they weren't the eldest daughter also. And I think the eldest has a whole other thing about it as well. But that can give you this space so that you're not so compressed, so you can actually enjoy your practice or enjoy your relationship. So I think that the key wins in coaching around this is the recognition and critically non-judgment, because what I see for many people who engage in coaching in healthcare is that there is a lot of judgment about how come I don't have boundaries and how come I didn't see this before. And I think if you can see that you were raised from childhood with it, of course you're not going to see it until you're made aware of it. And Maya Angelou says that, we can't change things that we don't see, but once we see them, we can change them. And so in coaching, it's really the recognition of where does this pattern show up in your life, in medicine and in the rest of your life? Because a huge part of the struggle for women in medicine is that we have, our work life and our home life, and both of them are full-time jobs. And so how do we pare them down? How do we get help or drop some of the perfectionism? It's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to do things imperfectly, but this eldest daughter syndrome is actually not okay in that setting. And it's interesting because, and this is where it gets fuzzy, right? It might have been okay, but we got so much praise for always doing it right that we aren't willing to make a mistake. And so again, it feeds in. So the shift out of it is pausing and slowing down and doing the exploration about where did it come from in your life and what parts of it are you holding and carrying and which of those is helpful, because there is a fair bit of it that is helpful. It's how you got here. And what part of it are you ready to peel off? And so you can continue. And I think we spend a lot of time blaming the system, but we also have to and want to have this clarity within ourselves, because it's going to make us better advocates about what's reasonable and what's not.
We're talking to Jessie Mahoney, pediatrician and coach. Today's Kevin MD article is The Burden of the Eldest Daughter. Jessie, let's end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Well, number one, just awareness of how many of the women in healthcare are eldest daughters and what that looks like. And then an awareness of how it's impacting burnout, and that we can make change not from a place of blaming ourselves or blaming those individuals, but from really focusing on what's human and what's reasonable. And just because it has been done that way, or you have done it that way, doesn't make it the right way to move forward.
Jessie, as always, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. And thanks again for coming back on the show.
Thank you.